let me introduce myself. I'm George Gamoda, but some of you might not know. I'm ethnic Ukrainian, and since 1991, I've been spending a lot of time with you in Ukraine with Ukrainians, working mostly on government, U.S. government projects. After I left the Pentagon, the government was very interested in having me do things there, which I did. So my background is since 1991, spending a lot of time recently, since February, trying to help in different ways, financially, but also morally, and just being in touch with people. Sadly, two of my colleagues are no longer here. One died in Kharkiv when one of the missiles hit the apartment where he was living. The other one was in Kyiv, near Bucha, not in Bucha, but he was chaperone and he didn't survive. So I'm coming in from a perspective from Ukraine, and some people might disagree with me, but history of Ukraine is complicated, with neighbors trying to take part of the land. And in the Middle Ages, when all of this began, there was a lot of things that were happening, assassinations, wars, and land grabs, and what have you. So I'll give you a brief history of Ukraine: language, religion, politics, war of independence, and the culture. But I'll take questions that are more relevant to what's happening today. As you probably heard, in Crimea, there was an explosion of ammunition dump. And the Russians said, oh, well, it was an accident. And the Ukrainians were quiet the first day, and the second day there was a special operation that blew the ammunition dump. So anyway, I gave you a little bit of background here. You can just scan through it. But as you can see, I spent times in the Pentagon fighting the Soviets, the communist threat. And then when Soviet Union fell apart, I felt it my responsibility to try to help Ukraine, and that's where I'm coming from. Okay, here's demographics. Ukraine is in Eastern Europe. In 1992, there were 49 million people. It's the it's the largest country in Europe that's totally in Europe. If you include Russia, which has part of it, western part of Russia in Europe, then that part is bigger. But otherwise, it's bigger than France, Germany, and all the other countries in Europe. It's divided into 27 oblasts, more or less like the U.S. states. And there's autonomous republic, which is the Crimea, and two special cities, Sevastopol and Kyiv. Language-wise, or not language, ethnic backgrounds, 77.8% Ukrainian, 17% Russian, and then others. There's a good Jewish population, Armenians, Hungarians, and others there. And this is as of 2001. So obviously this is before the land grab that Russia did back in 2014. Okay, brief history. The people there lived in the land, which is now Ukraine, for many centuries, millennia. But I would say by 9th century, groups started to kind of assemble, and Varangian Vikings developed a powerful warrior merchant system. And as you can see from the map, going from the north and down to the North Black Sea, there is a trade routes, and the Vikings loved that. And so Kyiv became a center point, which is in the top of Dnipro River, which is a major river in Ukraine that bisects it. And they used for merchants going from the Baltic countries, Sweden, Finland, down to Black Sea and out to the Mediterranean. And you know, in the U.S., Ukraine's history has been misrepresented basically by Russian propaganda machine, and that started after the civil war in Russia. The elites came to the U.S. in many numbers. The Russian elites who fled basically communism, and they settled and they brought their history with them. And so the American history of Ukraine was basically based on what they brought with them. You know, the way they play it is Russia, Russia, Russia. Well, there was no Russia at this point of time. There was Kyiv, there was Novgorod, and there were a few other cities, but the Vikings basically controlled them for a long while. And here, I mean, to prove the point, in Kyiv, there was a big statue of the Viking founders. There were three brothers and a sister who came and founded Kyiv. The oldest brother, Kyiv, is named after him. So, and the other brothers and sister have their own towns named after them throughout Ukraine. And the central, I guess, more important point is Volodymyr the Great, who was the principal, I guess he wasn't a Tsar, but I guess a prince in Kyiv. He decided that it was time that the people have a single religion, because the people that he kind of governed were pagans. And so he looked around and thought, well, should we become a Jewish state, Roman Catholic state, or Orthodox or Muslim? There was a Jewish state to the east of Ukraine, which was called Khazaria, the kingdom of Khazaria, which no longer exists, but they chose to become Jews. South were the Muslims, west were the Roman Catholics, Poland, and but down in what is now Turkey, in Constantinople, there was the Eastern Orthodox. And so he decided to become Orthodox. That's what people say. The other reason he might have chose Orthodox is that, unlike Roman Catholics, Orthodox are allowed to marry 3 times. And he loved women. So I think that's another reason why he might have chosen Orthodoxy. And so here is a statue in Cherson Nemos, where he became baptized. And this is in Crimea, and a western part of Crimea, which was then occupied by Constantinople. His statue kind of looms over the river. And the story is that the way he baptized us, he started fires in the city, and all the people had to flee, and they went into the river. And so he had a mass baptism in the river, and everybody became Orthodox. and that was in 988. The next probably important person in history is Yaroslav the Wise. He was a son of Voldemar, but he wasn't the oldest. So there was a fighting that went on between the brothers, and he won, and so he got the biggest trophy, namely cave. Uh, he was a very political strategist, and he had many children, and he married them off. And you can see here, he married his daughter to King of Sweden, which came in handy later. Uh, Married daughter Anne with King Henry of France. And if some of you who have been in Nice, France, there is a building that reportedly where she lived. She was the queen of France, and she lived there. She was literate, unlike King Henry. So the marriage certificate shows her signing her name, and King Henry put a big X for his signature. So Anastasia was off with Hungary and so forth. The other thing is he had 6 sons, and they were helping him govern the vast territory. But one of the big problems that the laws were that the sons each inherited a piece of land. And what that did is that led to kind of partitioning of the land that Volodymyr had. Now there was like 20 pieces of it, and they fought each other. So it wasn't a friendly neighborhood gang who lived together in harmony. The other thing that Yaroslav was noted for, he provided the first code of laws in the East Slavic lands, and it's said that Magna Carta is used some of his codes to create the current Western laws that are used today. Okay. Now, one of the grandsons of Yaroslav was Prince Yuri Dolgoruki, and that means translated to, he had long arms, I guess. And he fortified, he loved hunting, and he fortified a hunting lodge in the north. And that place was a birthplace of Moscow. It was just a hunting lodge that they used to go for boar and other things. The town got burned down by the Mongols. It was headed by Genghis Khan in 1156, and then everybody was killed there. The town, Moscow, was rebuilt again in 1236, but it was invaded by Mongols again. But this time, the ruling princes there accepted the Mongols as masters. And so some of the things that you see in Russian Orthodox churches and their codes came from Mongols. That was the price they paid not to get burned down again. Talking about Mongols, here's kind of a, and this occurred over several centuries. So it wasn't a single drive, but you can see the center of the Mongol was over here. Do you see my arrow or not?
Yes.
Okay, so the center is here, and so they went out west, and then of course they also went east and south, but I won't talk about that. And this is the route that Genghis Khan took. And this was, I guess, first one was 1207. Now, this is the Caspian Sea, and here's Black Sea. And so you can see the incursions here by going into north, which is now Russia, and back. Now, one of the things the Mongols had uh, to elect a leader, they had to come together in one big conference and to elect a new leader. So when Genghis Khan died, everybody came back. Now, you can imagine the communications at that time were not great. And so you're here now almost 1,000 miles. So it took a while for the new leader to emerge. Here is the second wave. And this is now Genghis Khan grandson, Batu Khan. And as you can see here, there's one that went up to Novgorod and Moscow. But then the other groups went west to Ukraine. They sacked Kyiv and created all kinds of things in approaching Western Europe. And to this day, if you talk to the Viennese in Vienna, they will tell you how the Mongols approached their walls. But what happened was, again, the leader died, and so everybody was pulled back, except that they left a lot of things behind. Namely, they raped women, regularly killed the men, and so the populations started to emerge where many of the children, I would say bastard children, attained some of the notoriety of their fathers who were long gone. And so the complexity here became very difficult during this time. Okay. Now, besides the Mongols, as I said, Kiev Rus became splintered by the way it was divided and given to sons. A new kingdom of Galicia Volhynia was formed from one of the grandsons, and it was subordinate to Volodymyr, and it existed from 1199 to 1349 and covered most of the land in modern-day Ukraine. Kyiv was destroyed, and so the capital were down in the kingdom of Galicia, and most of the people fled there. The founder of the kingdom was Grand Prince of Kyiv. Now, again, as I said, between the west bank of the Dnipro River was competed by various countries. As Kyiv became weak, the Poland, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth became big. Hungary and Muscovy now started to flex their muscles. There was still no Russia, but it was called the Tsardom of Muscovy. And the southern land was under Mongolian Tatars, especially if Constantinople was sacked by the Ottomans. The history is complicated here, and there are exchange of people, assassinations, and other things that are happening. The only stability was that the peasants continued doing what they do best, namely tend to the land. Now, as I said, Mongols did not go north very far, and they allowed Moscow to thrive. And this is because of the agreement between the people there in Moscow and the Mongols. Okay, let me go. Khmelnytsky and Moscow Tsar. Okay, Khmelnytsky was interesting. Many of the names have been either Policized or Russified. I mean, his even a guy named Tchaikovsky. The family name was Chaika, but to make it more sounding noble, or he became Tchaikovsky. Khmelnytsky is another guy. He was actually from a noble family in Poland, but he started a Kozak. He became a Kozak hetman. And who are the Cossacks? The Cossacks are essentially free people who lived in the middle of Ukraine, who didn't want Moscow or Poland to rule them, and they were kind of, free men. And they chose their leader, and Khmelnytsky was one of them. At this time, they were fighting Poland to the west, and Khmelnytsky turned to the Moscow Tsar and asked for help to fight off the Polish armies. And this was 1654. Now, this was a Treaty of Pereyaslav, which the Russians now say, hey, that's when Ukraine gave up its independence and joined Russia. Okay, well, it didn't last very long, because Mazeppa is another guy who wanted to be free of Moscow, and he asked the King of Sweden to help him fight Russia, but didn't succeed. And so to this day, if you ask Russians who Mazeppa was, they all say he's a traitor who was excommunicated from the Orthodox Church and so forth and so forth. If you talk to Ukrainians, he's a hero because he tried to fight the Russians for Ukrainian independence. Then shortly after, Austria-Hungary, which was now a big empire, in 1772, took a big chunk of Ukraine, which is sort of west from the Dnipro River, and included southern part of Poland. And so that lasted for almost 170 or so years until 1917. And so when my parents were born, they were Austrian citizens. And my father went to Vienna to study. My maternal grandfather was a PhD student in biology in Vienna, and he was also a officer in the Austrian Army Ukrainian division, and he played a big role in trying to have Ukraine be independent. And in 1905, he went to Kyiv to free Kyiv from Russia. But at that time, the Red Army and the White Army was fighting. He got caught, sent to jail in Kazakhstan. And then when the Red Army went over, he got free, and he went back to Ukraine. And then in 19...
George?
Yes.
Those dates aren't right, are they? I mean, 1905 is not the Bolshevik Revolution. There's
No,
Red Army until 1917.
No, but there was fighting, and the White Russians won. White Russians won. In Kyiv there was this fight, and he was caught in the Austrians sent him to help free Kyiv. He was caught by the White Russians, sent to Kazakhstan, and then when the Red Russians took over, he was freed and he went back. So it was sort of, in 1905, there were I wouldn't say a major war, but there was a fight for Ukraine, for Kyiv. And it continued in 1917 when said that they're independent. Uh, that was the first independence movement in Ukraine.
Excuse me, George.
George?
Ted has a
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. Your history skipped over the phase where a lot of Western Ukraine was Poland.
Oh yes, no,
I'm Vuf or Viv was a major Polish city before Poland was removed and shifted to the west. Can you
well,
fill in that detail as where that
sure,
came from?
sure. Basically, Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg are all the same city. It just depended upon who was there at that time. For 170 years, Austria, was the country that occupied it. And it was actually an easy occupation for the Ukrainians because they felt pretty, happy. My mother always, kind of revered the Austrian emperor because he loved Ukraine or the Ukrainians. And in fact, when Austria-Hungary fell apart, his two sons, one became Polish and one became Ukrainian. And so it was, there was no big animosity between during the Austrian time between Poland and Ukrainians. They intermarried, and you are right. Lviv was heavily Polish. The second largest contingency were Jewish, and then there were Ukrainians, and then others. The villages, the surrounding areas were all Ukrainian. And so this is something that people kind of have to understand. Powers can send people to cities, but powers don't send people to work the land. And so in the far reaches of eastern Ukraine, when it's very Russified, everybody speaks Russian. But if you go to the village, they all speak Ukrainian. You say, well, how is that? Well, the peasants have their way of being very, how should I say, resistant to change. And they will stay with their country and their language and their custom and what have you. So yes, Lviv or Lvov in Polish changed hands and people went back and forth. If you go to the cemetery, for example, in Lviv, where some of my relatives are buried, you see a Polish part of the cemetery. You see Russian part of the cemetery. You see Armenian. I mean, it's sort of like everybody's living together in one cemetery. And just over the years, this changed. But I am skipping lots of parts here to get to the more recent things. But
Well, I mean, it's relevant to the more recent in a sense because of the fact that after World War II, when they moved Poland to the west to punish the Germans or whatever, there was a huge movement of people from that western edge of Ukraine into Poland.
yes,
And they even picked up the statue of Sobieski and put him in Gdańsk.
look, I was on that train.
Yeah.
I was born in 1939 in May, and by August I was in Poland
Mhm.
because of the Russians. The Germans and Russians agreed. They had a peace treaty to sort of divide and what happened was that the eastern part of Poland or Western Ukraine Hitler and Stalin divided it up, and so my parents didn't want to be under Russia, so we fled to Poland, and we stayed there for 2 years until the Nazis came, and they said, "Go back. We need you back in Ukraine." And so, from 1939 to 41, we lived in Krakow, and then 41 to 44, we were in Ukraine. And then, when all hell broke loose, we fled, leaving, the Russians and the Nazis fighting each other. So anyway, but
that treaty was also when Belarus came into existence.
Well, Belarus was, this goes back to Peter the Great. Peter the Great used the term Russia for more or less for, Ivan IV of Russia, Muscovy, changed the name from Tsardom of Moscow to Tsardom of Rus. Okay, now that's significant because the people call themselves Russene, and so he changed it to Rus. Peter the Great had bigger ambitions, so he decided to call the kingdom of Russia, Russia. Now you have to, to an American, Russia, Rus sounds similar, and that was the intent. Peter wanted to sort of grab everything, and he was expander, and so he decided to call Russia, and so that didn't happen until 1500. Before that, there was the Russene and the Ruthenians, but he decided to call them Big Russians, White Russians, which were Belarus, and Little Russians were Ukrainians. Okay, so Belarus, the previous name was White Russians. So, but that goes back to 1600.
George, where does that go relative to there's a legend similar to the Romulus and Remus thing about the three brothers, Lech, Czech, and Rus, who supposedly were the founders of all those countries in the Slavic lands. Obviously, it's a legend, but there's a connection somewhere in there.
Well, Cain, the oldest brother, was the founder of Kyiv. So that, that statue is there for anybody to see. So I think it's more than a myth whether exactly it happened the way the three guys and a woman sailed. We don't know, but that's what the legend is. So back to, we're now 1600. The Cossacks were a group of people who lived in central Ukraine. Many of them were peasants who just got fed up with all the fighting that was going around them and decided to organize themselves in a fighting force. And this is a famous painting of the, they received a peace treaty from the Ottoman Tatars, and they're laughing their head off because they're responding in a very crude way. So if you see this painting, it kind of brings important anecdotes of how the Ukrainians feel about being overrun by neighbors. Okay. Now, as I said, 1917, 18 was very important. The empires were falling apart. The Austrian part of the Ukrainian army formed the basis of the Ukrainian resistance army. My grandfather was involved in that. At this time, they were fighting two ways. On the west, they were trying to fight the Poles, who tried to overcome Western Ukraine, or and they have their right, because there are a lot of Poles in Western Ukraine, and they call the Eastern Poland. And then the Russians, who finally took over, the communists, started to come south and absorb Eastern Ukraine and ultimately Western Ukraine with the agreement with Hitler. But in the middle there, Stalin wanted to reorganize the land on Eastern Ukraine, and the farmers, the sort of descendants of the Cossacks, were resisting to change. And so ultimately, what he did was he created an artificial famine and forced people to give up all of the things that they collected from the land. The way it worked was, initially you give collective, you give everything you have, and then you get some back for your livelihood. Well, for 2 years in a row, he took everything and didn't give anything back. And so people started to starve. And it was called the Holodomor, and 7 million people, Ukrainians, died. Now, they died and they left empty houses. And so what happened was Stalin then imported workers from Russia to Eastern Ukraine to kind of get the work done, because he still needed the work to be done in industrialized cities. And so the reason that there's so many ethnic Russians in Eastern Ukraine is because they're descendants of the group that were sent by Stalin to fill the houses. And if you talk to some of the oldest residents, because the Holodomor has now been studied quite extensively, some of the old people will tell you they're afraid for losing their house, because they realize that their ancestor stole it from the Ukrainians. So it's a complicated situation back there. And another thing that happened is in 1954, Crimea was made part of Ukraine as part of the USSR under its jurisdiction. Now, fast forward in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, and it basically fell apart because Ukraine voted for independence. Every oblast, including Crimea, by large majorities voted for independence in 91. And as I said, Crimea voted by 56% to be Ukrainian, to join the country, Ukraine. They had several elections. Independence was very important, but there were still a lot of people older who kind of wished for the old communist system. So it wasn't an easy thing to do. They had a number of revolutions. The Orange Revolution, many of you remember Orange Revolution. And this was because they felt that the election was faulty, and a lot of corruption. And they brought in a Ukrainian reformer, Yushchenko, and he tried to bring in reforms, but he wasn't very successful. I don't think he was a good. Previously, he did a lot of good things with the Bank of Ukraine, but as a president, as a leader, he was not very successful, and he fought fights with his prime minister, Timoshenko, who you might remember was the woman with the golden braid hair, that her kind of statement. And I personally think that Timoshenko would have been a better leader, and Yushchenko would have been a better prime minister, but it didn't work that way. In 2014, Russia attacked into Crimea and started a war of Donbas as a result of, again, another revolution that happened, the Dignity, Maidan, which thousands of people came to the capital and wanted to get rid of the corrupt president, who happened to be a friend of Russia. A new president was elected, Poroshenko, and you probably start recognizing some of these names. He was actually a pretty good president, but when 5 years later, after he served his term, people wanted some semblance of stability and wanted the new president to strike a deal with Russia, because by then Crimea was taken over by Russia, and parts of eastern Ukraine, broke off, and the Donbas war started. By 2019, 13,000 people died in ongoing war in eastern Ukraine. Crimea was stable, but eastern Ukraine, they continued to fight. Okay, which brings us to today, until February 24th. Everybody kept saying Russia was not going to attack. Russia was not going to attack, but they did. They had 150,000 people surrounding the country.
Why do you say that? I thought the U.S. was saying over and over again.
U.S., but if you go to Ukraine, they said no, it's the same thing. They're never going to. They're not going to attack. We have family ties. They just couldn't believe. They couldn't believe that Russia would attack. On the other side is, quite frankly, the military was prepared, and since 2014, the U.S. has been in a very systematic way training the Ukrainians, because Ukraine ambition was to be part of NATO, and in order to be part of NATO, your military has to adjust to NATO rules and regulations and basis. So unlike 2014, where the army was basically useless, in 2022, the army was much better prepared, and they were ready to fight. Although the Ukrainian president, even on the eve, didn't believe that, or he said that he didn't believe that Russia would invade. Whether he really thought he said this because he wanted to make people feel better, I don't know. But you're right. Americans and some Westerns said Russia's going to attack. Russia, day before, said, no, we're not going to attack. Lavrov dismissed the idea that Russia would ever attack Ukraine. Well, it was all lies. I mean, you don't have 150,000 people around the country doing training. So anyway, language. Ukrainian language is probably older than Russian. You see a lot of old Slavonic terms, and if you go to church, they use Old Slavonic even in Russia, and so you hear a lot of terms that are very similar. But Latin has come in, and so Ukrainian has evolved because of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire and other. The language evolved much more Western than Russian for a long while. But it's basically much more melodic than Russian. If you hear the two languages spoken side by side, you will clearly hear the difference. And people say, well, it's the same. No, it's not. It's like Spanish and Italian. You can probably get by with Spanish in Italy or Italians in, let's say, Brazil, but you're not going to get everything. And you're going to have strong accents. Most words are, 38 only % are common. The rest of them are not. Because of the history, most Ukrainians, or I say all Ukrainians, can communicate in Russian, whereas Russians don't understand Ukrainian. And, Putin needed a translator when he met with the Ukrainian President Yushchenko, who only spoke Ukrainian officially. And give you another kind of anecdote, when George H.W. Bush, right before the Soviet Union fell apart, he came to Kyiv and he gave his chicken speech. And this was very offensive to Ukrainians. But the Ukrainian president at that time, who was still appointed by Moscow, Kravchuk, insisted that everybody in his entourage spoke Ukrainian. And it was very frustrating because Gorbachev was there and he couldn't understand what was going on because they were speaking Ukrainian. Fortunately, George H.W. had a translator who understood Ukrainian, and so that went okay. But this was a very kind of pre-dissolvement of Soviet Union, where American president goes to Ukraine, and they all speak Ukrainian rather than Russian. So anyway, since 1991, by the way, English is the second language that every kid learns. And so you'll find that many in Ukraine speak English, sometimes better than Ukrainian, especially in Eastern Ukraine. And this is kind of a map. This is old now, but of languages. And the dark blue is more or less Russian dominated. And for example, when I traveled to Crimea, I actually had to look for people who spoke Ukrainian because everybody spoke Russian. And my Russian was not that good. I understood more or less, but I refused to speak Russian in Ukraine. And the other dark spot on the right side there of the map is Luhansk, which is one of the Donbas areas. The purple is kind of, 75% Russian speakers. The other areas are all Ukrainian speakers, although they will easily respond in Russian if you speak to them. And you can see the river bisecting Ukrainian kind of in half, the left bank and the right bank of Dnipro River. Okay, religion. It's something, Ukraine is basically Orthodox, but it's multi-denominational right now. I would say Orthodox is the dominant one, but then there are Ukrainian Catholics. There's Jewish populations that is growing. Muslims, especially the Tatars, who are, when in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, many of the Tatars left and came to central part of Ukraine. Now, this is kind of historical again, but when Vladimir chose Orthodoxy, at that time, there was one Christianity. There was no Roman Catholics or Greek Catholics or what have you. There was one Christian faith. But in a year shortly after 988, in 1091, I think, the Great Schism occurred between the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. And that meant that the Ukrainian Church, which was Orthodox, stayed with the Orthodox. Now, as Constantinople fell, Moscow decided to become the third Rome, or that's what they say, they're the third Rome. Rome, Constantinople, and Moscow. The Ukrainians didn't particularly care to be under Moscow Patriarch. And so there was the Union of Brest where the bishops, Orthodox bishops, met and voted to join the papacy. Now, they joined the papacy under the conditions that they could keep their customs and, pay homage to the Pope, but have their own separate system, which exists to this day. And that's where the Ukrainian Catholic Church was born in 1491, I guess. The priests are able to marry, and that's became a big issue in the 20th century, early 20th century, when you had immigrations coming and priests came and they were married. The Roman Catholic Church didn't like that. And so they said, well, new priests cannot marry, but there was a loophole that a young man who wanted to be a priest, a Ukrainian Catholic priest, could become a priest and marry as long as he got his priesthood outside of the United States. And so many of them traveled to Yugoslavia, which obliged the priests that were able to become priests, and then they came back with families. So to this day, it is customary to see priests who are married with children, except they're Ukrainian Catholic. Anyway, the Orthodox Church also went through a schism in 2018 where the Ukrainian Orthodox did not want to be under Moscow. And so they found a way of getting Constantinople or Istanbul, which had the patriarch, the Orthodox patriarch, give them the ability to become independent. And to this day, there are branches and they're fighting basically because now, as a result of the war, even the church that says we are under Moscow no longer respects the patriarch because situations happen when soldiers were killed. The Moscow priest wouldn't bury him because the man was belonged to another church, and so it really became kind of messy. I don't know if anybody wants to have any questions on this, but it is messy and it just needs to be studied in detail before you can understand what's going on there. But it's multi-ethnic and Ukraine is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, but it is mostly, how should I say, Caucasian in the sense of the people being homogeneous. If you go to Russia, you see a lot of effects that the people are not homogeneous. They are intermixed with the Mongols, the Chinese, and others, and so you have a mixture. You can see immediately a city, a Ukrainian city versus a Russian city, just the makeup of the people, look at their faces.
George,
Yeah.
since there's a gap right here, administrative issue. It's
Okay.
11:05, and you certainly have a lot more material you'd like to talk about. Tell me what you feel is comfortable for you.
I think I can finish everything in a few more minutes and then ask questions because
Okay.
I think I'm all right.
Okay, good. Just wanted to check. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So, and this is called autocephaly, which is the jurisdiction of who has jurisdiction over the church, whether it's Constantinople, now Istanbul, or Moscow. Okay. And here, this is a photo of Poroshenko on the left, who was president at the time, and the patriarch of Constantinople in the middle of there. And on the right side is the new patriarch, Ukrainian patriarch, when they took over responsibility for Moscow. Moscow, of course, didn't like what was going on, and they severed their ties with Constantinople, or the patriarch Constantinople. To this day, they don't speak to each other. But one of the interesting things is that you look at the faces of the Ukrainians, and they're mostly young men compared to the old stooges that you have in Moscow. And this is a rally in Ukraine to thank Constantinople for giving them the freedom. And this was in 2018. And today you have a situation where both the Catholic and the Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, bless the troops and, heal them and bury them as needed. Whereas the Russian Orthodox just, the Patriarch of Moscow blessed the war. He actually blessed the war and he said it was justified.
Why are so many of them masked?
Good question. I don't think it was COVID.
Would these be special forces?
Could be special forces, yeah.
They're not all masked.
No,
Okay, thank you.
but here is a Russian priest blessing a fighter jet in Crimea who is going to kill Ukrainians. So, I mean, it's religion is being used to satisfy the needs of the leaders. And this is, Kirill in Moscow with Putin, closely associated with Putin. And so the Orthodox Church in Russia very heavily supports the war. And some of them, some of the clergy have departed, dissidents, and they were excommunicated for not obeying Kirill. So now this is the cave monastery, which is probably one of the oldest monasteries in Eastern Europe. And anybody who goes to Ukraine probably should visit them. This goes back to 1100. And there are catacombs there that have on the side of the wall. I mean, you go there, it's like in the dungeons, and on the side of the wall are carved spaces, and the spaces contain the bones of monks who stayed there during the invasion by the Mongols. Now, Mount Athos is a seat of Orthodox religious power, and it's sort of like, I don't know, it's more like, it's not quite like Rome, but this is a place where all Orthodox from the world around join together in a peaceful way. Well, except that now that Russia does not recognize the authority of the Patriarch of Constantinople, they don't talk to each other. And so part of this now is off grounds and they're separated. They don't have a fence, but they don't talk to each other. But this is a place where they go to pray, and yet they don't want to talk to each other. So anyway, a book, more than one book has been written about this, so I won't go into detail. And since I'm Ukrainian Catholic, I really don't, I look at this kind of foreign to me. Okay, what's at stake? Of course, money, control, prestige, and historical landmarks. Now, a lot of this is changing rapidly, because quite frankly, less and less control from Moscow is being had. And even the people who once thought that Moscow was their kind of place to look up at, after bombs fell on Kyiv, it just, you couldn't continue to revere somebody who's throwing bombs at you. The flip side of this, and you hear this, Putin really thought that he could conquer all of Ukraine within a few days, marching in. And in fact, the troops that came to Kyiv, it was shown they had uniforms that they were going to use to parade victory. So these guys came not to fight, but they came to basically parade, to be a part of a parade of taking over Kyiv, because the belief was that all the Ukrainians were happy to see Russians take over. And of course, that didn't happen. And after a few weeks, very savage fighting, the Russians left Kyiv.
Only ones who thought that.
Hmm?
I say it was widely thought by Americans that
Well,
Putin would walk over.
Well, the feeling, I have to tell you, it's sort of some parts in Ukraine were really Russified to the point where they longed for the old control from Moscow. And so, in some ways, in Donbass, it was easier to do that, or Crimea. Another strategic error that I think Ukrainians made were when they gained independence, they decided to give Russia the right to have their navy in Sevastopol. Now, initially, it was going to be like for 5 years, and Russia was going to move their navy to another place on the Black Sea. But then the new president came and he extended that stay. And the last stay was extended 45 years. Now, imagine the following. I can ask you this question. San Diego, how many people do you think have a relationship with the Navy, U.S. Navy? Quite a few, right? Why? Because the Navy base is there, and guys who retire like the area and stay there. And so over the years, 30 years, many of the senior officers of the Russian Navy decided to retire in Crimea. And so from 1991 to 2014, the complexity of the population changed radically. The ethnic Russians increased proportionately while the Ukrainians decreased. And so it was not that big of a surprise, to me at least, that when Russia took over Crimea, it was fairly easy because most of the people there, many of the people there were old Russian guards from the Navy. So anyway.
And was not the Crimea originally taken from the Turks by Russians? And
of course.
yeah, so and in fact, it was rather this surprising thing where Stalin detached Crimea from what would be what SFR, the Russian Federal Republic, and gave it to the Ukraine. That was a surprise.
Well, but what he did was essentially in 1944, I think, the population of Crimea was heavily, I think, more than 50% Tatars. And what he did is, had trains and trains moving Tatars to Central Asia. And as you look at the map of Russia, there is a oblast there called Tatarstan. Well, Tatarstans in Central Asia are basically descendants of the Tatars that were expelled from Crimea in 1944. So it's, so in 1944, Stalin got rid of the Tatars, and he settled Crimea with Russians, but then also Ukrainians. So the complexity of the people changed. And then when Ukraine became independent in 91, the policy was that the Tatars could come back. And so we had thousands of Tatars who came back to Crimea in 91 through 2000. And then when Russia again took over, they're being expelled. So it's, but as I said, strategically, Ukraine never should have allowed Russia to continue to have their base there in 91. And they could have just done it, period. But
So I didn't quite understand. Are you saying the Qatars are being expelled again?
yes,
Huh.
because they refuse to become citizens of Russia, and so the Tatars. I don't want to say numbers, but there are quite a few now in central Ukraine, in Kyiv. In fact, they have their own. They used to have their own like a legislative body, and then moved now to Ukraine. And so they're very, very strongly pro-Ukraine because Ukraine gave them freedom to essentially rule their own lives.
I assume they're Muslim.
Yes, they're Muslim. So no, in Ukraine, as I said, it's multi-ethnic and multi-religious, and religion does not play like a central role other than religions that have affinity to some other country, like in this case, Russia. There's a problem, but there's Roman Catholics in Ukraine. There's in Lviv, there is a cardinal, a Roman Catholic cardinal. There's a church, in Kyiv that's Roman Catholic, and they're pretty loose in terms of religion and accepting people's beliefs. So
Were you surprised when Zelensky turned out to be so strong?
yes, definitely. I actually wanted Petroshenko because Petroshenko I thought was a better president. And,
Did you
Okay.
ever watch any of the Zelensky Servant of the People?
yes, I did. On Netflix.
Yeah. And I mean, it seems like sort of reality copying TV.
Well, this is, I guess, politics. He started out strong, but then started disappointing people because he started appointing men and women who really had no knowledge of governing. And so he stumbled a lot. And quite frankly, the war, he really has done a wonderful job of being a war president. He was not such a great president during his 2 years when he was, didn't have a war to work. But as president, I think he's marvelous. I mean, his speech and his daily, he has a
We will not show you our backs. I think is the great line.
well, he says, I don't want transportation. I want ammunition. So, and I have to give him credit. I mean, he's just terrific, and the whole family. And it was a shock, I think, to Russia because they expected him to sort of flee, not only go to Poland or something, or to, who knows, Israel, whatever, to escape. And here he was saying, hey, I'm not leaving. I'm going to stay. So that really gave the population the needed push from the president on time. How he's going to do, Ukraine, I mean, this is personal, I think it is in a very tough spot because on one hand, Russia can always increase the pressure by, like even tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, And I don't think the West would react much differently than what they're doing now. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but I just think that Russia's not going to give up easily. And if we can go back to February 24th, I think to me it would be a good place to start.
I mean, do you think that actually could happen? I mean, aren't they going to have to give up something?
Russia would have to
Putin
give-
can't come out of this empty-handed unless
No,
he falls from office. I mean,
yeah, well, that's can happen, of course. The Independence Day of Ukraine is 24th of this month. And I'm sort of thinking maybe not very realistically, but the goal is to take over the Kherson, which was the first city that fell.
take over the what?
To take over Kherson. Kherson is a city that straddles the Dnipro River east and west. And it was the first city that fell to Russian aggression. And part of the reason now we know is that the mayor of Kherson was colluding with the Russians. And so it was an easy take. What happened in Kherson, Putin was hoping would happen in Kyiv, that he would just walk in. But now the Ukrainians are putting up a fight and trying to take over Kherson. And if they do that, I think that's going to be a big plus. So we'll see. Where are we? Okay, well, there are a lot of political parties in Ukraine, and politically it's very active. Unlike Russia, they've had 30 years of independence and political. They had 6, 7 presidents elected during that time, and so it's been very active in terms of the people are very active and are willing to throw out leaders who are ineffective.
Yeah, I just make a comment, George. You started out by saying that the history that we have learned is the one brought to us by the Russians. I find what you say very congruent with what I was taught at Columbia, where I was at the Russian Institute for several years. I mean, I feel like that what I got was pretty much the straight stuff. It agrees with what you're telling us. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that. Columbia, of course, has a strong institute, and it has the same as Harvard. I think they
I have a degree from that institute.
Okay. Well, congratulations. So who was your teacher?
Congratulations that they're doing a decent job.
Yeah. Now, Parliament in Ukraine is a little sometimes rowdy. I mean, they have some fights, fist fights. But, it's all political in the sense that different voices can occur, differences, and it's not monolithic.
Are you sure these are not scenes from the TV show?
No, no, it's not TV show. These are actual Parliament fights. There were 2 fights, I guess this was before the war. I mean, like a year ago, 2 years ago. And their fist fights broke out. Here is a picture of photo from the Orange Revolution. I actually took that. I was there in a hotel, and I took a photo down below. And you can see this is the main thoroughfare in Kyiv. And it was just set up with tents and thousands of people, and this lasted a long time. Uh, Now, the 24, see, this was not very, it was not bloody. I mean, it was a peaceful revolution, but it was not bloody. This one, of course, 2014 was bloody because the president was a Russian-backed Yanukovych and did not want to change. And the reason for this was that Ukraine voted to become part of European Union, and it started over time to become part of Europe. And in 2014, when the Yanukovych decided not to sign the agreement with EU, but sided with Russia, this happened. And so he sent out his goons, and 100 people died in the clashes. He fled and is now in Russia, but this is sort of what started the chain reaction in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, where you had the little green man with no insignias taking over Crimea. You remember that? Putin said, no, those are not my guys. And then admitted that they were the military who removed their insignia so they wouldn't be identified as Russian.
Hi, George.
Yeah.
A couple of things. First of all, it's 11:30 and you just passed halfway through. I'm wondering if maybe we want to continue this at another time. I want you to think about that. It's just that you.
Yeah, I know.
I don't think it'd be fair to you for you to go through the second half of yours in 10 minutes. Okay. All right.
All right.
And
Okay,
also, we have Ted Kuczynski who Kuchansky, sorry, has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hi, Ted.
George, very interesting way of viewing all these things. Obviously, there's a personal perspective there that the rest of us don't have. But what I was very much interested in is today we see this situation where there's almost a two Ukraines involved right now. There's the Eastern Ukraine where there's actual war going on, and there's the Western Ukraine starting at Kyiv, where Putin throws a rocket every once in a while somewhere. But when you look at it, it doesn't really, you don't see a war. Professor Harchenko from Kharkiv has relocated himself. I don't know if he brought his family with him. I think he did, but I'm not sure. To a high rise in Kyiv, and he gave us a tour from the windows of his place. He's near the river, and you can see 5 building cranes that are active right now. It looks like a Western, type of city that's under construction, and you wouldn't think about it as if there was a war going on just 100, some odd kilometers away from. So can you kind of put that into context, how that can happen at the same time? I mean, it's almost like there was a war going on in, Albany, and in Boston, they're going ahead building buildings like they were, yesterday.
They're rebuilding as we speak, and there's a tremendous amount of rebuilding.
But these were these were new towers. That were
No, I know, but remember, just a couple of miles away in Bucha, almost everything was destroyed. And so part of the reason for the new buildings is for people to be located, to move there. But there, Bucha, when it was destroyed, and I don't have photos that I can show you, it was terrible. It was awful because it looked worse than World War II. But then today, you see rubble, but they're cleaning and the streets are quiet. And so, yes, the people are, they were spooked, and but they decided that they're going to continue living. And as you know, there was 5 million Ukrainians that fled to Poland, and Poland, just opened their arms, and they still, welcoming them. But there are a large number that are going back, and the women and children whose husbands can't leave, they want to be together. And so, my concern is not necessarily the adults, but I think the children who have witnessed this, the impact that's going to have on them is. I was on Zoom with my cousin in Lviv, and in the background I heard a noise, and so he showed, the camera, and there was smoke, and there was one of those rare times where a missile came to Lviv. Now, it doesn't happen that often, but, people have just adjusted to that this is happening, and they want to continue their lives. I don't know how long this is going to continue, but the Ukrainians are very resistant and resilient in their determination not to have their life disturbed. And I think that's something that you can see that.
George, we have a question from Dick.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, George, quick question. What is the Donbass region? Because Russia seems to have a real interest in that region. I mean, from a geographical standpoint, what is it?
They are very rich in minerals. That's where the coal mines were, but also lithium and other metals. And quite frankly, people are thinking that that's why they want that, because otherwise it's a very poor region. But if you can extract minerals, especially now lithium, it will become very important.
So is that the eastern part of Ukraine?
Yes. So, Luhansk, Donetsk, that's, you see my arrow?
Yes.
Or that's the Donbass over there.
Ah, okay.
And they want a corridor to Crimea. And so that's why Mariupol, which was over here, was so important.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important, but they destroyed it. So, I guess you can put a road through it, but that's about it.
Wow.
And, Kharkiv is up here, and that's second largest city. And it's only like 30 miles from the Russian border. And they tried to overtake that, and Kharkiv was defended, which is, to me, unlike Kyiv, which is the capital, Kharkiv was very much Russian speakers there dominated. And they said no. And they fought, and it's in Ukrainian hands.
Should we pause or stop at this point? Pause, because you can continue at a later time.
That'll be fine. And, maybe some months go by and things change. I can tailor
That would be very good.
the talk to more of the current situation.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you very much, George.
Okay,
George,
pleasure.
George, thank you very much. And from me personally, and I'm sure lots of other people, all the best to your family over there. It puts a personal face on this thing that you just read about, and it's heartbreaking.
It is. It's unbelievable in 2022. If something like that can happen, basically in a European, normal country. I mean, it's.
Anyway, thank you very much, George.
All right. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
George.